The movie starts, and we see a little girl happily walking in the forest, carrying a basket in her hand. She hears a raven and looks at it. Her mood drops and she starts walking faster. It suddenly gets windy and the leaves start to fly. The girl gets off the road and goes inside the forest to hide. She waits for a while and starts running again. She doesn't stop or turn back until she reaches her doorstep. She looks back and gets inside of the house. She closes the door, but it opens back up and leaves get inside when she is putting the basket down on the table. She closes the door again, but sees something when she turns around. The camera films where she was looking, but we don't see anything there. The camera turns back to the girl, and we see her suspended in the air. Leaves start flying into her mouth, and she screams. We see a group of soldiers going through the forest. They get to a clearing and see someone hanged on a tree. They think that it's a scarecrow at first, but see that it's a human when they get close. One of the soldiers, Edgar Allan Poe, gets close to him and starts looking at his organs that are carved out. The man moves, and Edgar asks him who did this to him. The man says, Raven. The others suggest burying him and going on with their way, but Edgar says they need to bring him home. They argue for a little and Edgar convinces them. They get to a town called Raven's Hollow. They start going through it and find a group of people in the cemetery. Edgar introduces himself and says that they found him not so far away from here. They thought he was from this town because he said Raven before he passed away. A girl approaches Edgar and asks him to show her the man's face. Edgar removes the cover from his face, and the girl's face changes. An older-looking woman steps in and says that they don't know him. Another woman from the group tries to go towards the body, but a man stops her. The girl says that her mother meant to say that he was just a passerby. Edgar asks if they'd seen him before, and the girl's mom tells him they can only offer them food and a place to stay. Then the group leaves the soldiers behind. Edgar turns to his friends and asks if there's anyone who doesn't want to stay there tonight. We see them in front of the guest house, and Edgar gets inside. The girl's mother comes out one of the doors while talking to a man. Edgar tells them that they decided to stay. Another man comes inside, and the woman introduces him to Edgar. He tells the man, Usher, to take care of their horses, and Edgar asks about the hanged man. The three stop and look at each other. Then the woman tells Usher to put him in the cold room. The other man, Dr. Garrett, introduces himself to Edgar and asks him if he can examine the body. Edgar allows him, and we see the girl writing their names into the guest book while her mom watches them. She asks them for their names. Edgar and his friends, Lawrence Bishop, Will Taylor, Thomas Crick, and Lutz Becker, introduce themselves. Poe asks for the girl's name, and she says it's Charlotte. She introduces her mom, Elizabeth. Edgar asks if there's any town police, and Charlotte says there's barely a town here now. Elizabeth asks why he's asking this, and says that the man didn't get hanged here. Edgar responds her saying that the person who did it was probably from this town. Edgar asks if he stayed in one of the rooms here. His name would be in the book if he did, and Charlotte says he only stayed for the food. Edgar says that's a shame. They might never find out who he was, and Elizabeth sends Charlotte to check the food. Charlotte closes the book and gets out. We see a man going to Dr. Garrett, who's examining the body. The doctor asks him, Daniel, what he wants. Daniel says that he already knows what he wants, and the doctor says it's not the time, he needs to wait for it. Daniel grabs his collar. They both threaten each other, and Daniel leaves. We see the soldiers having dinner while Elizabeth and Charlotte serve them. Elizabeth asks Edgar if the man was tortured, and he describes it. Elizabeth keeps asking him questions, and tries to get information about what he said to them. Then Edgar asks her about the funeral they had when they came to the town. Elizabeth says that it was a funeral of a girl named Mary Keene, the girl we saw in the beginning of the movie. Then we see Edgar drawing in his journal, sitting next to the fireplace with Lawrence, who's playing guitar while the others talk among themselves. Charlotte starts singing and everyone stops and listens to her. Then we see Lawrence going outside with Thomas, and they run into Usher. He gives them information about their horses and hesitates to leave. Lawrence asks if he wants to tell them anything, and Usher tells them that they need to leave. Usher tells them to leave tonight, and not wait until the morning or they might not survive. They don't want outsiders here. We see Charlotte trying to talk to Edgar about the hanged man. Lawrence asks Usher what he's trying to tell them, and Usher says there's no one responsible for what's going on in the cold room. Thomas asks Usher what it is, and he says it's Raven, not a bird but a demon. It had been there for a very long time. They ask him if he saw it, and Usher says he might have done. He warns them about not staying for too long before he leaves, and says it'll come here, it always does. Then we see Edgar in the barn, playing with his horse, trying to make him take the apple from his hand. Then we see him about to go to bed. He blows out the lamp and looks out of the window. He sees Charlotte in the garden in a white dress. She slowly turns around and raises her arm to point towards him. Edgar backs off and gets away from the window. Then we see Thomas waking up in the night because of the sounds coming from outside. He goes out of his room to check it, and something holds him suspended in the air. Thomas looks scared, and it drags him out of the building. Thomas gets up from the ground and starts running. It catches him again and drags him to a stake. They go to Edgar in the morning and tell him that Thomas is gone. They look for him around the house and get outside. Edgar goes to the church while the others look around in the town. Edgar sees a wolf on his way. He sees Elizabeth talking to two men with Dr. Garrett. He tells them that Thomas is missing and asks if they saw him. They say no, and Dr. Garrett tells Edgar that they decided to bury the hanged man in their cemetery. They say they will do anything to help them find their friend, and Edgar gets out. He runs into Charlotte, and they start walking together. Edgar asks if she saw Thomas. Then he asks her why she was outside last night, and Charlotte says she doesn't remember anything like that. She gets back to the house, and Edgar goes to his friends, who are with Usher. They interrogate him, and Usher says the Raven took Thomas. Edgar asks if he's trying to scare them away, and Usher says that he doesn't think that they will be able to run away. They go out and argue about it. Then they suddenly remember the place where they found the man, and they run there. Edgar and Will don't find anyone there, but Edgar notices fresh blood marks on the ground. Will points to someone with a black coat, and he starts running away from them. They chase him and eventually catch him, and we see that it's Daniel. We see Lawrence and Lutz walking through the town, and they notice a wolf with a hand in its mouth. They start chasing it. Edgar asks Daniel why he ran away from them. They continue asking Daniel questions, and we see Lawrence and Lutz about to catch the wolf. They notice the bloody stake, and we see the others going to a shed with Daniel. They get in and see an old man. Daniel tells them that Thomas is gone and shows them his dad's scars. Edgar goes to the man and asks him how that happened. The old man says it was the Raven. It's not a bird, but it's a demon. Edgar gets back up, and Daniel calms down his father and gives him medicine. Edgar asks him how he gets the medicine. Daniel tells him that he gets it from Dr. Garrett in return for the bodies he gives him. The medicine doesn't take away the pain, but his fear. The fear that one day the Raven will come back and finish what it started. We see them back in the guest house, and the others take them to the bloody stake. They say the wolves ate the rest of him, but Edgar notices dragging marks on the ground. They follow them and get to an old building. Edgar breaks in, walks around, and notices the floor cracking in some parts. He finds Thomas's body in pieces. He gets out and they argue. Lutz tries to hit him, but they separate the two. Edgar says a human must have done this, because a demon wouldn't bury a body. Will mentions the axe, and we see them walking with Usher. Elizabeth, Charlotte, and Dr. Garrett leave the guest house, and Elizabeth asks them what they were doing. Edgar says that Usher's arrested, and he is the Raven. Elizabeth tells them that they are stupid, and she goes inside. Edgar, Dr. Garrett, Charlotte, and Usher follow her inside. Edgar tells her what happened and how they found Thomas. Dr. Garrett and Charlotte try to convince him that it's not true. They are wrong about Usher, but Edgar doesn't listen to them. We see Dr. Garrett examining Thomas's body when Edgar and Will come into the cold room. They talk about it, and the doctor gives Edgar the magnifier for him to look closely at his bones. He says that they are in too good a condition to be beaked apart with a bone. Edgar asks him how he thinks it happened, and we see him getting out of there with Will. Will asks him if he believes the doctor, and Edgar says the bones tell it all. They argue about it for a little, and Edgar tells Will that he wants to walk around alone for a while. We see Charlotte coming up to Edgar, and they sit at a bench together. They start talking about the Raven. She says that she saw it, and starts telling the story to him. She says that she was out with her sister, and they saw something in the sky. At first they thought it was a bird, but it wasn't. It took her sister, and they never saw her again. Her father passed away from the sadness, and her mother acted like none of this happened. Usher helped her when she needed it the most, and he was like a father to her. Charlotte begs Edgar to not take him from her, and we see him arguing with his friends in the barn. Edgar says he just wants one more day, and they continue arguing. Will leaves with his horse, and Edgar follows him behind with his own horse. The Raven comes and takes Will. Will's heart drops on top of Edgar, and he passes out. He comes back to the barn, looking distraught. He gives them the heart and frees Usher from the ropes. Usher catches him before he falls to the ground, and Edgar wakes up back at the guest house. He sees Dr. Garrett in front of him, and Lawrence asks him what happened. Edgar says that the legend was true, it was the Raven. Elizabeth takes Charlotte out with her, but Charlotte looks at the box on the table that has Will's heart inside before getting out. Edgar describes how it looks, and Usher says it's a demon. Lutz asks why it didn't attack him, and Edgar says he doesn't know. He asks the doctor, and he says that it's playing with them. Then we see Edgar back in his room with Lawrence and Lutz. They try to convince him to come with them, but Edgar says he can't. Then we see the two on their horses, and Edgar warning them to be careful. They get going, and we see Edgar putting the box on the ground and shooting at the air. Elizabeth watches him, and Usher comes up behind and hugs her. They talk about Edgar and how brave he is. We see Daniel coming to Edgar and taking him to the church. Edgar gets in and sees Lutz's body parts scattered around. He falls to his knees and Daniel helps him get up. Edgar asks for his help to trap the Raven, and Daniel says you can't hurt it, you can only run away from it if you're lucky. We see Lawrence and Lutz stopping because their horses start acting stressed. Lutz starts acting weird, and Lawrence asks if he's okay. He suddenly turns into leaves, and they form a raven. The horses run away and Lawrence looks at it from the ground. Edgar goes back to the guest house and he gets out the guest book, but Elizabeth comes out, pointing a gun at him. She threatens him, and Edgar asks again who the hanged man was. They talk, and Edgar tells Elizabeth that the Raven took her daughter, asking how she can still protect it. Usher comes and gets the gun from Elizabeth's hand. They hug, and Charlotte joins them. Then she tries to attack Edgar, and tells him to go away. Usher stops her and tells her to get her mother to her bed. They talk, and Edgar notices something. He goes to the church and sees the bishop's surname is the same as the girl from the beginning of the movie, Mary King. He goes to their house and looks around. We see Lawrence running in the woods, and he gets to a place with ravens inside the trees. Then we see Edgar seeing Lawrence inside the house. They start talking, and Edgar notices him acting weird. He notices that it's not the real Lawrence. He starts walking towards Edgar and asks why he's different from the others. Edgar runs out of the house and continues running. He gets to Daniel's house and sees pigs inside. He closes the door and Daniel attacks him with an axe. He manages to get him down, and Daniel tells him that they are eating his father. Edgar lets him go inside and finish it. Daniel comes out and tells him that the raven did come back for him. Edgar asks him what happened in Mary's house, and Daniel starts telling him the whole story. He says that the bishop was her brother. He told them that the raven was a demon, and he was trying to get it away with rituals and prayers, but it did nothing other than make it more angry, so it took his sister. He convinced the people that the only way to protect them was through sacrifice, like it said in the legends, and we see him getting hanged in the tree where Edgar and his friends found him. Edgar asks Daniel why it attacked his soldiers, and Daniel asks why it didn't attack him. They hear the bell, and Edgar says it's their last chance. He asks Daniel to help him finish off the raven. Daniel hesitates at first, but Edgar convinces him, and they make a plan. He drinks from the medicine to prevent the raven showing itself to him as someone else. They get in front of the town and start talking about Charlotte. Daniel tells Edgar that she didn't have a sister. It was Charlotte that the raven took. She came back after months, but she was different than before. Edgar asks him if anyone else came back too, and Daniel says no. Edgar says Charlotte is the raven, and they get inside the town. They get to the cemetery, and Edgar looks at Charlotte, but he doesn't see any difference in her. Dr. Garrett tries to talk, but Charlotte stops him. Then Elizabeth comes out, and Edgar sees her as the raven. He tells Daniel that she's the one, and he starts walking towards her. Edgar pushes Charlotte to Daniel to hold her, and he shoots Elizabeth. She turns into the raven and everyone looks in shock. She harms Daniel while flying away, and Edgar runs to him. Daniel says Charlotte's name, and Edgar sees her hitting him in the head. He wakes up and sees Usher taking him to hang him like the bishop. He tries to talk to him, begging him not to do it and to let him go. He asks him if he put Thomas's body in there, and Usher says yes, he did it to make them get out of there, because they would stay and investigate what happened to him if they saw his body. Usher tells him why the raven didn't attack him, and he ties Edgar to the tree while he begs him to not do it, but Usher apologizes and goes away. Edgar sees the raven, and it slowly approaches him. It turns into his horse, and Edgar gets it to help him free himself by pretending that there's an apple in his hand. Then he jumps on top of it and goes back to the town. He goes back to the guest house and sees Usher drunk, covered in blood, and attacking all around him with a knife. He gets inside and sees Elizabeth's body covered with blood on the side. He yells at Usher, but he thinks that he's a ghost. Edgar says he's not a ghost, and Usher laughs at him. He suddenly attacks Edgar with the knife and he manages to get away from it. He tries to run away, but Usher eventually corners him. Then he realizes that he's real and apologizes to him. He asks Edgar to forgive Charlotte and realizes there is a bloody knife in his hand. He runs to Elizabeth and sees her body. He cuts his own throat and falls to the ground. Edgar finds Charlotte hiding in a room and helps her get up. She tells him that Usher is crazy and he tried to hurt them. Edgar tells her that they'll get on the road at dusk, and she tells him that he's crazy. They get downstairs, and she sees Usher's body lying next to her mom's. They get outside and see the raven, looking like Elizabeth. Edgar gets on the horse with her, and they gallop through the fields while we see the raven following in the sky. Charlotte tells Edgar that the raven is in love with her, and asks him if he knows what love is. She tells him that it will finish him if he stops or runs away. It will finish him if he ever hurts her, and eventually it will find him wherever he goes. Edgar stops his horse, gets off, and helps Charlotte to get down. He tells her that he loved her from the moment he saw her. He starts complimenting her and kisses her. He starts backing up, while saying that if it really loves her, it wouldn't let her get away, it wouldn't share her with another man, and it wouldn't risk losing her. The raven comes down, takes Charlotte, and flies away while she screams to be let go. Then we see Edgar. While we hear that he got expelled from the military academy, and they will hide this case forever. Edgar sits down at his table and takes from the medicine. He writes, "The raven," on a piece of paper, and we see young Charlotte looking at something and going inside Mary's house. The movie ends there.